glad that we could be here tonight. This is our first evening in our new spot here, so I trust for the Lord to meet with us, and thank you for coming. Tonight we're going to continue in Isaiah, so if you have your Bible, please turn to the book of Isaiah, and why don't we go right to chapter 40 of Isaiah. And we were saying last week that Isaiah wrote the whole book of Isaiah. And that might sound so obvious to us, but to so-called scholars, it isn't obvious. And you say, well, I'm not a scholar. But here's the issue. Here's what happens. Those scholars, so to speak, teach people preparing for the ministry, young men or women now preparing for ministry. So then that goes into the pulpits of many churches, of many denominations. That's the problem. And so many churches are being led by pastors who do not believe that Isaiah is the author of the whole book of Isaiah. And once you deny that authorship, then you start denying the dating. And once you deny the dating, then you extract the miracles from the prophecies of Isaiah. And the whole book in itself, in a sense, loses its authority. So authorship is important. And just to give a quick example on this, look in John chapter 7, where, and in your notes I said, Jesus himself taught that Isaiah wrote the whole book of Isaiah. And here in John, and I said the wrong chapter, 12, if you go to John chapter 12, look at verse 38. And in John chapter 12, verse 38, it says that the saying of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spoke, Lord, who hath believed our report, and to whom hath the arm of the Lord been revealed? So what chapter is that? That's 53. Now, then it says, therefore they could not believe, because that Isaiah said again, he hath blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, that they should not see with their eyes. And verse 41, these things said Isaiah when he saw his glory and spake of him. So what chapter was that? When Isaiah saw the glory of Jesus. That was chapter 6. So the point is that when they say there's multiple authors of Isaiah, they say someone wrote Isaiah chapter 1 through 39, and someone else wrote Isaiah 40 through 66. So here Isaiah wrote in both sections. And those might not have been the actual words of Jesus, but obviously the Gospel of John. And Jesus quoted from Isaiah many times. And always when Isaiah is quoted in the New Testament, he's the only author attributed to the words. So again, it's attacking that. So now that would be also an attack against the authority of the Bible, because it says there Isaiah wrote it. So if Isaiah didn't write the first section, it says it in the New Testament. Isaiah, you see what I'm saying? So it's just it's really a very devious attack. Okay, so in Isaiah chapter 1 through 39, the emphasis there is on the judgment of God. And in chapter 40 through 66, the emphasis is on the comfort of God. So that's page 7. That's the first blank in our notes, the comfort of God. So look at Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 1. And how does it begin there? Why don't we start in the back? Mandela, could you start with that? Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 1, please.
40, verse 1. Comfort ye my people, saith your God.
Okay, go ahead. Well, just the next phrase.
Okay.
It says then,
speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem.
Okay, so that's the beginning of this great section, comfort. And we see that like a thread run through the section. The comfort of God. Look, for example, in 49. I have the verses listed there. You can see them in your notes. Let's look at some of these. And Christy, could you please read 49, verse 13?
Sing, O heavens, and be joyful, O earth, and bring forth into singing, O mountains. For the Lord hath comforted his people, and will have mercy upon his people.
Okay. Now again, what is this section all about? What is the comfort? Isaiah is prophesying that what is Babylon going to do? What is Babylon going to do? Going to destroy Jerusalem, burn it to the ground, essentially, take them into captivity. But the comfort is they're going to what? Return. They will return. And they will rebuild the city. That's the comfort. That's what this whole section is about. And it's all prophecy 150 years before it happens. It's all a prophecy. And so look at Isaiah 51, verse 3. Micah, could you please read that?
For the Lord shall comfort Zion. He will comfort all her waste places. And he will make her wilderness like Eden, and her desert like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness shall be found there, and thanksgiving and the voice of melody.
Okay, so there's going to be waste places. It will have been destructed, but it will be built up again. So that's the comfort. Look in 52, verse 9. 52, verse 9. Jeannie, could you please read?
Break forth into joy. Sing together, ye waste places of Jerusalem. For the Lord hath comforted his people. He hath redeemed Jerusalem.
Okay, again, similar theme. And 54:11. Do you have that, Christina?
All thou afflicted, tossed with tempests, and not comfort, behold, I will lay thy stones with fair colors, and lay thy foundation with sapphires.
Okay, so God is giving them comfort, but were they receiving it? What does that say? It says no. But what is God saying? I will rebuild. You will rebuild, and it's going to be with these beautiful stones, is what he's saying. So again, he's trying to give them encouragement and comfort in the midst of darkness. It's hard to see that for them, but God is giving him his word of promise. Okay, in chapter 61, just a couple more here, 61 verse 2. And Joni, do you have that, please?
Yeah. To proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all that mourn.
Okay, to comfort all that mourn. And of course, that's the passage Jesus quoted in his first address in Nazareth. And then the last chapter of Isaiah, again, so this theme of comfort goes from chapter 40 all the way through chapter 66. And in 66:13, Anna, if you could read that verse, please.
As one whom his mother comforted, so will I comfort you, and ye shall be comforted in Jerusalem.
Amen. Okay, so the theme of this whole section is what? The comfort of God. So please, that's a good thing for you to know. Now, this is truly Isaiah 40 through 66, to me, is one of the most miraculous passages in the Bible. Miraculous, not because there are miracles like in the Gospels. I mean, the Gospels tell stories of miracles. But this passage is so miraculous for the prophecies that it foretells. And I like this next statement. We said earlier in the first part that the whole book of Isaiah, some say, is like a Bible in miniature. This section, even more so, we could say, is like the New Testament in miniature. Now, why would we say that? The New Testament in miniature. It has 27 different chapters. And even in the Hebrew, there are 27 separate sections in the original text after an introduction. And this passage begins where the New Testament begins. If you read the Gospel of Mark especially, where does the Gospel of Mark begin? Where does the New Testament begin? With a voice. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3. What does it say there? The voice of him that cries in the wilderness. And so where does the New Testament begin? Who is that voice in the New Testament? Yeah, that's John the Baptist. So here, this section, it begins with this voice crying in the wilderness. By the way, now, this voice crying in the wilderness is what? What is this voice comforting the people with? that they're going to come out of captivity, and God will make flat every mountain and raise up every valley and make smooth those rough places so they can come out of that captivity, return to Jerusalem, rebuild, and give them that comfort and hope. So that's the voice crying in the wilderness here. At the very heart of this section, what's the heart of the New Testament? Is Jesus and his work of the gospel. So we're saying there are 27 different chapters and sections in the Hebrew scripture, from Isaiah 40 through 66. Well, what's the center of that? What's the heart of that? What's the middle chapter of that? Isaiah 53, which is one of the greatest prophecies of Messiah and how he will suffer for our transgressions and be bruised for our iniquities. But the pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand, and he will rise again. So Isaiah 53 is the heart of this passage. And then this section ends where the New Testament ends. The New Testament ends with God making a what? A new heaven and a new earth. And that's where this passage ends. If you look there in Isaiah chapter 65, almost the end, almost the last chapter, but toward the end of the whole sections, Isaiah 65:17. Isaiah 65:17. Behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former shall not be remembered, nor come into mind. So this is why, too, and if you could put a few things together in your mind, even in our church-wise, preaching from Malachi, Isaiah wrote this as a prophecy with them returning back to Jerusalem. It almost seems as if when they go back to Jerusalem as well, that Messiah will come, there will be a new heaven and a new earth, there will be the consummation of all things, that there will be the kingdom, long-awaited kingdom. But they went back into Jerusalem, they did rebuild the temple, but then no Messiah and no eternal kingdom. So that's where the people were wondering they're trying to put all that together. And here we still wait. 2,000 or so, that would be like almost 2,400 years later. We're still waiting. So, but this passage ends where the New Testament ends in that sense. Okay, so very interesting. Now, any questions? Joni?
Pastor, I'm just wondering, was there any reason for the Babylonian captivity?
Yes.
What was it? I'm sorry.
Total idolatry, rebellion, unbelief of the people. If you read the Chronicles and read the Kings, and you'll see that what came into the temple was a mixture of pagan religions, Jeroboam's counterfeit false religion, compromising disobedience to the word of God, idolatry. They went after many lovers. They committed adultery against God spiritually.
So Isaiah is a pre-exilic prophet.
Yes.
Right? So prophesying that there will be a Babylonian captivity.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like a warning of their sin, right? You're doing this, so then God will, allow Babylonians to capture you. But in the midst of the consequences of your sin, God will comfort you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. And okay, so, and even look at this next verse. Okay, so now here's another thing that's very interesting about this passage. Look at these 3 points I have under the outline. Your time has come. Your iniquity is cleansed. B. And in letter C, I'm going to ask you to cross out joy and put judgment. Your judgment is complete. And both are true, but I think judgment actually says more clearly what I'm trying to communicate there. Their judgment was complete so they could have joy. That's really the idea. So here's my understanding of this passage. In verse 2, each of those points is introduced. In the first phrase, it's okay, so the theme is given, the comfort of God. And then her warfare is accomplished. In other words, your time has come. Then it says, her iniquity is pardoned. That is the cleansing of iniquity. And again, at the heart of that passage is Isaiah 53. That's the second section. In other words, that phrase relates to this second section now, from Isaiah 49 through 57. Okay, let me back up. So in Isaiah 40 through 66, there are three major sections to this passage, okay? From chapter 40 through 48, okay? Now, let me show you what I mean by this. Look at 48:22. Go to 48:22. The way this is arranged is so amazing to me. I hope I could be able to communicate this. What does it say, 48:22? What does it say? There is no peace, saith the Lord, unto the wicked. That's the end of the first section of Isaiah 40. It goes from Isaiah 40 through Isaiah 48:22. There's no peace, saith the Lord, unto the wicked. And what I'm saying is that first phrase is a summary of that section. Her warfare is accomplished. Carries the idea that her period of severe trial and travail is come to an end. And this section ends with Isaiah 48:22. There is no peace, saith the Lord, unto the wicked. Now, the next section, her iniquity is pardoned, her iniquity is cleansed. It goes from Isaiah 49 through the end of 57:21. And how does that section end?
There is no peace, save the Lord, to the wicked.
Same thing. Okay, so it has the same ending as 48:22. So, and each section is 9 chapters. If you notice that also. There's 27 chapters. Each section is 9 chapters. And then the third section goes from 58 to the end. So that's kind of how it's arranged. Okay? But now, go back to, I hope, are you with me? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, to confuse you a little more, just a little more, go back to Isaiah 40. So I'm saying verse 2 has the 3-point outline of the whole section. Your time has come. That is, your warfare is accomplished. Her iniquity is pardoned. Her iniquity is cleansed. And her joy is complete. She hath received of the Lord's hand double for all her sins. She's paid. In other words, God really did bring a severe judgment upon Jerusalem. And now, that judgment being over, she can go forward and have the new, a new period, a rebuilding, a restoration, joy, because of the completion of God's judgment. Now, still in this introduction, because really this, if you look here, the first section begins at verse 12. You see what I'm saying? When your time has come, it begins at Isaiah 40, verse 12. So from Isaiah 40, verse 1 through verse 11 is an introduction to this whole great section of Isaiah. And I'm saying verse 1 and 2 has the theme and the outline of the whole section, right? Now, in verses 3 through 11, there's 3 voices. 3 voices. Look at verse 3. What does it say? The voice of him that cries in the wilderness. And that voice is basically saying, your time has come. You're going to return back to the land. That voice in verses 3 through 5 relates to the first point, which relates to the first section from chapter 40, verse 12 through chapter 48:22. That was the voice of him that cries. And he's saying, the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. And then in verse 6, there's another voice. The voice said, cry. You see the voice? In verse 3, the voice. And then verse 6, the voice said, cry. What? All flesh is grass. The grass withers, the flower fades. But the word of our God stands forever. And that voice seems to relate to that second point, your iniquity is cleansed and pardoned. And even to the Messiah coming. And then the third voice in verse 9. O Zion, that bringest good tidings, get thee up into the high mountain. O Jerusalem, that bringest good tidings, lift up thy voice with strength, and say unto the cities of Judah, behold your God. And then verse 10, the Lord will come with strong hand, and his arm shall rule for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his work before him. That's very messianic. And so there's three voices here, and it could be, and this is my understanding of it, that the first voice relates to the first point and the first section, the second voice to the second point, the second section, and the third voice to the third point, the third section. And then he begins, these 27 different chapters or messages of Isaiah. Okay, so that's how I think Isaiah is strong. I'm just giving you, that's a survey, right? That's just a survey. But I'm trying to give you the structure of, and I hope that would, maybe next time you read Isaiah, think about that and look back at your notes and then read in view of those different chapters. And I hope it will help in your better understanding of Isaiah. Another thing,
Those three
go ahead.
voices refers to who or what?
Just to the people to listen, to hear God, to receive this comfort that their time has come. The warfare is accomplished. They will be returning. Their iniquity is cleansed. The voice is hope. The voice is comfort. The voice is promise. You're going to rebuild. You're going to be restored. God has brought judgment, but now he brings deliverance and a rebuilding and a restoration of those waste places.
Yeah, it's a little confusing that third voice,
Yeah.
it's a command to the voice, as opposed to like, oh, I hear something. So,
What's interesting? Yeah, that's good, Mondello. Is that who is this? Who is to lift up its voice here?
the people.
Jerusalem, which was what? What had happened to Jerusalem? What did Babylon do to Jerusalem? It had destroyed it. So God is saying to the city, you lift up your voice again, because the voice had gone silent. But you lift up and say to the other cities of Judah, behold your God. What was Jerusalem to the nation?
Capital.
It was the capital, but it was for them the capital of what? What was there?
Oh, God's temple.
The temple, the one place where they could go and offer sacrifice for sins. And so Jerusalem was to say, basically, we're back up and running, the temple is reopened. Behold your God, come to Jerusalem, worship the Lord. Is the hope there? Behold your God.
So that verse 9 is depicting the end of Isaiah. It's like the end section.
I think so. That's what I'm saying here. That it's more. If this is structured the way I'm saying that I believe that it is, then that verse 9 through 11 relates most clearly to that passage from chapter 58 to the end. And again, that's just a structural. That's my understanding of it. I'm giving you my understanding of it.
Then 6 and 7, it's basically talking about the gravity of, is it Jerusalem? Like, what shall we cry? It's like that desperate, but the voice is telling them what to cry, but then that's not very hopeful.
What's hopeful? What's the hope there? Because we know life is brief, but what is our hope? The Word of God.
What are you talking about?
From verse 6 and 7, Anna was saying, that life is brief. We're all going to get mown down like the grass, and the grass is going to wither, and we are in process of withering. But the Word of God shall stand forever. I think that is the hope. And of course, his prophecies will stand forever. Getting back to what Joni was saying before, okay, remember what history does Isaiah give in chapters 36, 37, 38, right before this whole section? What does he tell about? He tells about how Assyria, which had already brought the northern kingdom into captivity, has now surrounded the southern kingdom, Jerusalem, and Hezekiah as the king, and totally mocking them, like, you guys are toast. We're going to destroy you. But that's where Isaiah and Hezekiah, they pray, and God sends his angel and kills like the whole Assyrian army. And he delivers them from Assyria. And just so then after this, and Isaiah is predicting that Babylon will have destroyed, so they didn't want to believe that, many of the Jewish people, which really leads us to Jeremiah too, because that was what Jeremiah was predicting and prophesying, that Babylon will destroy Jerusalem. But the Jewish people didn't want to believe that. They're like, no, God will deliver us the way he had done to, that Assyrian invasion, Okay, so that's just my survey of Isaiah. Do you have any questions about Isaiah? Oh, and if not, do you have any questions? Okay, so you know what? I want to go back just real quick. Go back to letter D on the top of page 7, I think, the 4 servant songs. Have you ever heard of that? The servant songs of Isaiah? Okay, look at these. These are so beautiful. Isaiah 42, chapter 42, look at verse 1. We're not going to read all of the passages, but just to give you, to show you these servant songs. Isaiah 42, verse 1. So do we go back to Mandela? Why don't we go back to Mandela? Okay, Mandela, can you please read that?
So 42:1. Okay. Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my elect, in whom my soul delighteth. I have put my spirit upon him. He shall bring forth judgment to the Gentiles. Okay, here he says, behold my servant. God's saying, look at my servant. Now, who is that? Who is that servant? Jesus. That is Jesus. Was that verse quoted in the Gospels relating to Jesus? Most definitely, Matthew himself quotes that passage, right? That sounds familiar. Remember? Go to Matthew chapter 8.
This is the worst working of my own life.
Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12, verse 17 and 18. Who's got that? Who's got Matthew chapter 12, verse 17 and 18? Do you have that, Esther?
Yes.
Okay, you can.
That it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, Behold my servant, whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he shall show true judgment to the Gentiles.
Okay, so this is the first servant song, and it relates specifically, we know from the Bible, to Jesus, because this is right after Jesus was doing miracles and so forth, and Isaiah says, Jesus is fulfilling what Isaiah wrote. He is this wonderful servant, okay? So that's the first song. Look in chapter 49. And verse 3 is the second servant song. And Christy, could you please read verse 3 down through 5, please? Yes.
And said unto me, Thou art my servant, O Israel, whom I will glorify. Then I said, I have labored in vain, I have spent my strength for naught, and in vain. And surely my judgment is with the Lord, and my work with my God. And now saith the Lord, Abhor me, and I will to be his servant, to bring Jacob again to him. Though Israel be not gathered, Yet shall I be glorious in the eyes of the Lord, and my God shall be my strength.
Okay, and so this is the second servant song. I believe it's referring to Jesus as well. There's no New Testament passage that I don't think that specifically quotes those verses, but does quote verse 6. We actually looked at that last week. But nevertheless, this is the second servant song. Now, and here is the theological battle for the servant. Who is this servant? Who is the servant here in verse 3? What does it say? Who is the servant? Israel, right? Israel. It says, "O Israel, my servant, O Israel." And so even when you get to Isaiah 53, Jewish people say that servant of Isaiah 53 is not Jesus. It is national Israel and for all the sufferings that they've gone through. But of course, we would say no. The servant songs refer to the perfect Jew, the perfect Israelite, Jesus. Okay? So look in chapter 50 is the third servant song, Isaiah chapter 50 and verse 4. I'm trying to find the word servant there. Let's see. I'm not seeing it right off, but this is called the fourth servant song because, again, now this is very messianic, and we'll see how does this relate to Jesus. Micah, could you please read Isaiah chapter 50 and verses 5 down through 7, please?
The Lord God hath opened mine ear, and I was not rebellious, neither turned away back. I gave my back to the smiters, and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I hid not my face from shame and spitting. For the Lord God will help me, therefore shall I not be confounded. Therefore I have set my face like a flint, and I know that I shall not be ashamed.
Amen. Okay, and actually down in verse 10 is the word servant, who obeys the voice of his servant. But how does that relate to Jesus? How does that passage relate to Jesus?
He was marked on the cross.
Yeah. And how specific are these? What did he give his back to? To the smiters. How is that fulfilled in the New Testament? Very specifically. How did he give his back to the smiters? In what way? When he was what? Remember, he was scourged. That was on the back. And what does it say? They plucked. I gave my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. Does it say that they plucked out his beard? Yes, it specifically says that. So that's another. I hid not my face from shame and spitting. Does it specifically say that they beat him and spit in his face? So all three of them were specifically and minutely fulfilled, by Jesus. So that's the servant song of him suffering. And then, of course, the last song would be Isaiah 53, but it really begins at verse, this chapter could actually begin in Isaiah chapter 52, verse 13, where this song of Isaiah 53 actually begins, did you know that? In chapter 52, verse 13. And how does that verse begin? Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. And think of this, it's going to go into the depth of his suffering, but he humbled himself and became obedient unto death so that he would be exalted higher than all. So, my servant, verse 14, as many were astonished at thee, his visage was so marred, more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So it tells us about the beatings he took on his face, right? And his visage was so marred. So these are all prophecies. These are the servant songs. 4.
Can you tell me the fourth one again? Sorry.
It's here it's right there from Isaiah 52, 13 through 53, 12. That's under letter D. All those scriptures are given. Wow. Okay. Any questions before let's get into Jeremiah if there are no questions. Anybody want to make any comments or anything? You just
Can
like
you have the blanks, please?
on page 7.
Yes, please.
Okay, Micah's got them for you right there.
Thank you.
Okay, let's look at Jeremiah, the weeping prophet of Judah, the man in his times. Jeremiah was one of the most successful men in history from God's perspective. But he was an absolute failure and a reject in his day. He was one of the most hated and despised of all the prophets. I mean, at least from what the text says. Like reading Isaiah, you don't see where people hated Isaiah. But reading Jeremiah, you see where they really hated Jeremiah. I mean, they did not like him. He prophesied during the last 5 kings of Judah: Josiah, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Zedekiah. So again, what's the difference? Isaiah is way out from the Babylonian captivity. He's living through the Assyrian destruction of the northern kingdom, Israel. But he's predicting the comfort that will come after the destruction of Babylon. But he's living way before it. Jeremiah is living right before it and in the middle of it. He went through the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, so letter A, he prophesied during the dark days of Judah. Into the Babylonian captivity, for he witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon in 586 BC. So, and by the way, if you read Jeremiah's destruction of Jerusalem, it's almost exact to the description given in the Kings. Do you know why? Because Jeremiah wrote the Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings. Jeremiah, the prophet, wrote 1st and 2nd Kings, which were really the history of the kings from a prophet's point of view. The prophets are emphasized in 1st and 2nd Kings, Elijah and Elisha. And then Ezra, the priest and scribe, he wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which is the history of the kings from a priestly perspective. So that's why we have, by the way, the Kings and the Chronicles. One is written with a prophet's emphasis, one is written from the priest's emphasis. Okay, but Jeremiah witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem, wrote of it in Jeremiah, also the Kings. He was born during the reign of King Manasseh. His father served as a priest. He preached from 627 BC until the exile of those in Jerusalem in 586 and beyond, preaching during the reigns of Josiah, Jehoiakim, Zedekiah. He is a weeping prophet to a wayward people, whereas Isaiah boldly proclaimed of judgment to come. Jeremiah compassionately spoke of a judgment at hand. The people of Israel constantly misunderstood Jeremiah as a traitor. That's why they threw him in jail. He was saying Babylon will come and bring destruction. They said, you're a traitor. You have switched your loyalty to Babylon. And you're no longer Jewish, basically, because he was predicting this judgment. He was thrown in jail. His ministry was sad, stormy, and lonely. He is the lonely prophet. I don't see anybody believing Jeremiah, except maybe a scribe, Baruch. He hung fast. Letter D, he was a prophet like Jesus Christ. Okay, so like Jesus, he preached the temple had become look in Jeremiah 7, verse 11, a what? Chapter 7, verse 11, what does that say? A den of robbers. Is this house which is called by my name become a den of robbers in your eyes? He called. Now, what's the metaphor he's making there? Thieves in Jerusalem. Let's say somebody was a thief and a robber. They would steal And where would they go with their spoil? They would go up into the mountains where there were caves, and that's where they would live so that they wouldn't be found out. Kind of like how Osama bin Laden, how he got away. He hid out. He knew where to go and where no one could find him. That was like his hideout. Jeremiah is saying that's what the temple has become like. It's become like a hideout for the religious class, and they're just a bunch of thieves and hypocrites and robbers. And Jesus, when he cleansed the temple, he quoted that. He quoted Jeremiah. So by the way, Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 11, what you should know from Jeremiah, this is his most famous sermon, perhaps. And it's called his temple address. If you could write that in your margin somewhere. In Jeremiah chapter 7, and actually in 8 and beyond, it's Jeremiah's temple address. And it's one of his most famous sermons that got him in a lot of trouble. In fact, if you might want to put this somewhere, because Jeremiah is structured very different, and it's difficult, the structure of Jeremiah. And that's why I gave you that little paper. If I could just refer to this paper for just a moment. I don't know where mine actually went. I have it around somewhere. See this little paper? Can you pass another one up here for me, please? Yeah, okay, thank you. So the thing with Jeremiah, and I barely even can tell you what an outline of Jeremiah is. I wouldn't even say the outline I'm giving you in these notes is really even an outline. He's very difficult to outline because he doesn't give his prophecies in chronological succession at all. And I don't know why these chapters and why they're ordered. I can't even tell you, really. I don't know Jeremiah well enough. That would be something to actually further investigate. But look at here. Look at how it's all over the place from year. It's not like it's just it's not chronological at all. So if you're going to read Jeremiah, you have to kind of like really pay attention. They'll tell you sometimes when he does a message in the 4th year of King Jehoiakim or something like that. So sometimes he'll tell you when the prophecy was given, but he is a kind of all over the place. Okay, so I just wanted to bring that out. But Jeremiah chapter 7, okay, so here's what I was going to say. So Jeremiah chapter 7 is this temple address, right? And where is that? Okay, do you see, look on your chart. You see where it says 7 through 10? You see where? Now look across. What chapter, the last chapter given, is at the exact same time? 26. Yeah, so go to chapter 26. And his message is summarized in verses 1 through 6 of Jeremiah chapter 26. And then look at verse 8. It says, "Now it came to pass when Jeremiah had made an end of speaking all that the Lord had commanded him to speak to the people." That's the very address from chapter 7. Actually, so try to follow Jeremiah, man. So and so now, but what this chapter gives you is really their response to what Jeremiah said in chapter 7. Because when you read chapter 7, you're like, wow, that was a great sermon. They didn't think it was so great. Actually, this is what they wanted to do to him. In chapter 26, it tells you the response they had. In verse 8, when Jeremiah made an end, it says that the priests and the prophets and all the people took him, the priests, the prophets, and all the people took him and said, "You're dead. You're dead," from what you just said. So why did you prophesy? Why prophesied in the name of the Lord, saying, "This house shall be like Shiloh," which he said in chapter 7, if you read that. "And this city shall be desolate without an inhabitant." in heaven. All the people were gathered against Jeremiah in the house of the Lord. So it's this temple address. When he called them a den of robbers, they didn't like that. They said, you're going to be toast, you're dead. And that's when they took him, and that led to a lot of persecutions against Jeremiah. Okay, so trying to give you some high points here, but that's it. Is that interesting? I don't know. I get to say what I think is interesting. I don't know. Sometimes I don't know if it's interesting to you, but I think it's so interesting. He was the lonely prophet. Like Jesus, he preached the temple had become a what? A den of robbers. And that sermon was called the what? The temple address. And that's what caused so much persecution and hatred against Jeremiah. That's a high point of Jeremiah. Okay, like Jesus, he wept over Jerusalem. Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 1. Oh, that my head were waters. You know, and they hated him, but not because his heart didn't break. It's just because his message broke them. He had a very broken heart. Like Jesus, he was rejected by his own people. He was cursed for his righteous stand. And Christ is spoken of by Jeremiah in much a different way than Isaiah. You know, Isaiah, we looked at the servant songs. But Jesus is in Jeremiah also. He is the fountain of living waters. He is the balm of Gilead. But look especially in chapter 23, verse 6. Well, actually go to verse 5 and 6. Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 5 and 6. And we'll have to end with this. Jeannie, if you could please read that.
In his days, Judah shall be saved, and Israel shall.
I'm sorry. Could you go up to verse 5? Yeah, if you could add verse 5 to it. Thank you.
Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will raise unto David a righteous branch, and a king shall reign and prosper, and shall execute judgment and justice in the earth. In his days, Judah shall be saved, and Israel shall dwell safely. And this is his name whereby he shall be called, the Lord our righteousness.
Amen. Who is that?
Righteousness.
That's Jesus. What does that verse tell us about Jesus? He is a righteous branch. He is a what? He is a king. And he will, what do kings do?
Reign.
That's right. He will rule. He will sit on that throne of David. Jeremiah is telling us this. And when he rules, Judah will be what? Do you know that national Israel will be saved? That's what Jeremiah is telling us. And Israel shall dwell safely. That's always, whenever you see that, safely. When has Israel ever dwelt safely? But they will during the millennium. That's millennial promise. And he shall be called the Lord, Jehovah. Jesus is God. This is in the Old Testament. Jeremiah and Isaiah, and they both clearly teach the deity of Jesus. And this is a powerful passage for Jesus in the Old Testament, God, our Messiah. Amen.
Amen.
Okay.